Welcome back to the Anglotopia Podcast. This week's episode is going to be slightly different than previous episodes over the summer. So last autumn, John Goodall, who is the architecture editor of Country Life magazine, came to Chicago and did a lecture and book signing for his book that he was a co-author of called Country Life at 150. For those watching on video, this is what I'm holding up on the video. And it's a fantastic, massive coffee table book that's about the history of Country Life magazine and how it chronicles country life in Britain. Beautiful book, great book. And I got to talking to John, and he agreed to do an interview with me after he had left Chicago. And so last autumn, we recorded the interview, and then a few things came up afterwards, and with the Anglotopia redesign and a lot of other things and work situation, I wasn't able to get the interview published until this past summer. And when I published the interview, and we had just resumed the podcast, because last autumn we weren't doing the podcast we hadn't for a few years, I realized that I had a audio and video recording of this interview that would make a great episode of the podcast, because we talk about country life in Britain and all that wonderful stuff about the countryside and the English countryside. So I asked John if we could use the interview as an episode of the podcast. So this is me introducing that, and then in a second it's going to go to the interview that's been edited for brevity and whatnot to sound good for a podcast, where we talk about John's career, chronicling heritage in Britain and all that wonderful stuff. So slightly different than how we've been doing podcasts this summer, but hopefully the result will be the same. Anybody listening to the podcast won't tell the difference, but anybody watching will see that my hair is much longer, my beard is much longer, and the camera angle is completely different, because if this was last I think December when we did this. So if you want to learn about all things wonderful in the English countryside and how the magazine Country Life chronicles it, and how John Goodall writes and chooses which great houses to cover for his architectural histories, then this interview is for you. And so I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Let's start with, can you introduce yourself to our readers a little bit? Give us your background. What sparked your interest in architecture and the built landscape?
So I'm the architectural editor of Country Life. So I'm responsible for producing the weekly articles that appear in the magazine and have appeared in the magazine since the 1890s, which covered principally country houses in Britain and its surrounds. But we do, of course, go abroad as well, both in Europe and in the States. I have been doing this job now for 16 years, in fact, which is incredible to me.
Wow.
But it's, and of course, I've seen an enormous, the great joy of it is you see an enormous amount and you have to look at everything. But by training, I was a medievalist. I did a doctorate at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And I initially, my first sort of writing was doing guidebooks. I wrote guidebooks for English Heritage, which is the state body that looks after historic properties. And I did one only, for the National Trust on Bodiam, but these are a long time ago, Bodiam Castle in Sussex. And so I suppose I became interested. I'm also the child of diplomats, and we lived abroad a lot. And I became very interested in buildings when I was living abroad. And latterly, we served in India, and that's a place that I began to look at buildings that seemed completely different to anything I was familiar with. And I think also one of the great advantages of living abroad is that it made British architecture, which many people take for granted, seem really interesting and unusual, because I wasn't here all the time, and it seemed to me quite as unusual in a way and exotic as the things I saw elsewhere in the world. So with those kind of different layers of experience, I became fascinated with medieval buildings. But as I say, the great joy of Country Life is you see so much, you meet really interesting people, and you've got to write about everything. And that's a hugely valuable experience. And to me, having spent a lot of time abroad, traveling to remote parts of Britain, as you will appreciate, seems to me quite as exotic as anything else.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the appeal for me is, I live in Indiana. There's very little of architectural renown in Indiana. We're a bit more in Chicago, but we famously just destroy our heritage. I mean, everything is new here. And so one of the things I love about traveling to Britain is that we can, see old things.
Yeah, no, indeed, and I think that anywhere in Europe, particularly wherever you travel, there is so much to see. Even if you get stuck on a train in a train station somewhere, you can just pop out and see a parish church, and it will be nearly always have something. It will nearly always have something amazing to see in it.
Yeah, and that's always been really surprising. No matter what small town or village you're in, you've got a building with an unexpected architectural or cultural history that you didn't even realize. And yeah. So, okay. So going back to your lecture you gave to the Royal Oak a few weeks ago, you talked a lot about the early days of country life. Do you have any interesting anecdotes or stories to share about the more recent history of country life? About who the current owners are, who the stuff that you can't incriminate yourself with.
No, well, I suppose the interesting thing about the magazine today is that it draws its inspiration from the past and the traditions of what it does, but all the time you're recording the way in which the past intersects with the present, and that. So for me, the two delights of it are, first of all, getting out and seeing so much, and discovering how vibrant Britain as a whole, and I mean wider things too, but Britain in particular, is that there are so many things happening with country houses at present. It's not at all a nostalgic world necessarily. It's full of vibrancy and new initiatives, and I find that enormously rewarding. And the other thing that I suppose I find so wonderful is that because I'm commissioning photography each week of the very highest quality, that I have the opportunity somehow to see the things that have just visited, to see them framed and recorded to a professional standard, very, very high standard. So all the time, I think it's this privilege of experience and seeing things out in the field, but then also seeing them, as it were, in two dimensions back at home, and realizing how special and magical they are. I mean, country life is a sort of extraordinary entity. It is the only public. I think probably in the world. It is the only glossy weekly magazine, and for things such as the coronation, at the beginning of the year, we were producing the magazine, I think, at the end of April and the beginning of May. We had 5 issues, which were more than 1,000 pages of advertisements and editorial. I mean, no other magazine is doing anything on that scale. And it's amazing to be part of that, to be with this very professional and really engaging team of people. But also, as I say, that's as it were the engine driving what I do. But of course, the other joy of what I do is I'm always out. I'm always seeing things. I'm just seeing much, much more than most people would ever, see. And that privilege of that access is something I don't underestimate at all. So it's a hugely, and because of the machine, because it's totally remorseless, every week it's a new issue. It means that you get everything as good as you can, but when it's gone, it's gone. And again, I think a lot of people can appreciate, you don't trail weed in country life. It comes and goes each week, and you kind of get it off, and it's always a fresh beginning, though the experience builds up, and that's very, very stimulating.
Yeah, I've always believed that country life it's sort of a national treasure, because it's a difficult thing to make a business case for if you're starting it from scratch.
You never could. I mean,
yeah, but it already exists, and so it's great that enough people want it to continue to exist, so that it's still there every week doing what it does. And I've read it on and off for 20 years, and it's remarkable how consistent and continuous the magazine is.
Yes, I mean, and as I talked about, in Chicago, of course, some elements of it have just gone absolutely, unchanged. It does change all the time, and yet it's variations on a theme. And there are those points where you can say, yeah, the frontispiece or the architectural coverage, it really does run right back through that 125-year history, the
Yeah.
garden coverage and things. And so that is it, and it's good. I mean, somehow, in a world where anything is theoretically possible, it's really good to have the disciplines of those threads that allow
Yeah.
you to do what you do and sort of see the world from that perspective and what you have to produce.
Well, and as you mentioned and conveyed in your presentation, even though the magazine's an ephemeral weekly thing, it's also an important historical record. Even when you understand in context that the images are staged.
Yeah, no, indeed, it is, and actually also, I mean, it is effectively a history of the last 125 years, written admittedly from a very particular perspective, but
Yeah.
told week by week.
Yeah.
And so, particularly when it covers major episodes, and I suppose doing the coronation of the Queen's funeral for me has been obviously very important in the last year. But I mean, if you look at the First World War, the Second World War, how it covers those things before the outcome is known is really, really interesting. You sort of get that sense of a cumulative history. And of course, in architectural and garden terms, it is, anyway, I would have thought, but it is just in terms of pages and images, it is by far the greatest published survey of British architecture that exists anywhere.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so next let's talk about the book. So that you can get your plug in for the book. So what was the genesis of this book? Who approached you? Was it the publisher? Did you guys approach them? And then whose job was it to sift through all the gorgeous thousands of pictures and decide what was going to be in it? Because it's complicated.
Well, I mean, it's a sort of collective effort. I mean, obviously, there was the 125th anniversary coming up,
Right.
and we could see that coming, and we wanted to do something that would celebrate that. I'd done books with Rizzoli before, and so it was a sort of natural match in a way. They do these beautifully produced illustrated books, and it was a natural match. And Charles Myers, who's the sort of commissioning editor there, was very enthusiastic about the idea of doing a 125th volume. And then really, it was up to Kate and I to try and work out how we were going to structure the book. And that's, as with everything, the frame determines the subject matter, because you could go anywhere. So it was she and I, obviously with Rizzoli's input, that thought about this. And then a former archivist at Country Life, Melanie Bryan, was very helpful in kind of going through images. And I mean, I'm going through images all the time, and I know what's been photographed under my watch, and I have responsibility in a way for the archive. So compiling all that expertise and familiarity, that's basically where the book came from. And Rizzoli too, they had a particular vision, I think, for it, and they have infilled some of the images too, because they wanted the book to conform to their vision of what they wanted to create. And the designer, Rob Dalrymple, has put together, he's brilliant, and he's used these images to stupendous effect. I mean, as you've seen with looking at the book.
I agree. It's gorgeous. As a small scale publisher myself, I was very envious. I'm like, oh man, I'd love to put out a hardcover like this one day, because it's so beautiful. And that's with Rizzoli has done books like that before, and the other publishers who do the big coffee table books, that's just, they're like a way for people who can't visit Britain to kind of inhabit it for at least a temporary amount of time. So thank you for all the hard work that goes into these texts, because they're a joy. So let's change tack a little bit, and I'm as an expert on British architectural heritage, I'm interested to know, what are some interesting American buildings and stately homes that you particularly admire? Did you see anything when you were here that really excited you?
Well, I mean, of course, predictably, I was really interested to see Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, and I mean, they do speak to obviously what's going on with contemporaries in Britain and the late arts and crafts movement, as I think is well recognized. I did wonder whether one aspect of them that is underappreciated in America, and I certainly didn't see discussed, was the connection with imperial and colonial bungalows. That in fact, what's called the prairie style does actually look very like the kinds of things that British people are building in colonial
Huh.
settlements in India and in Southeast Asia. That long, low creation of buildings for the climate.
Huh.
I did wonder whether there's a resonance there that you could pick up on. In other words, it's not entirely novel. It has a kind of colonial foundation, and I wonder whether Frank Lloyd Wright was aware of that. But they're such delight. I mean, I did think they were delightful buildings. I really enjoyed seeing. I'd been to New York before, but I'd never been to Chicago before. And I did think also in the gap between the time I was last in New York, that there has been another leap for the sky with the skyscrapers there. And I was struck by the degree to which even buildings such as the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building in New York are vanishing in the skyline of New York. And I thought it was so wonderful to go to Chicago and see the skyscrapers actually legible. You could see them. They weren't
Yeah.
overwhelmed because I mean, after all, what happens is you get one or two really interesting skyscrapers and then lots of weeds that grow up between them. And if the weeds begin to choke the imaginative buildings, it seems to me you do lose something. And I did wonder in New York as to whether the skyline had just gone completely crazy
Huh.
in a way that things were no longer intervisible.
I think it's our position on Lake Michigan helps with that because all the lakefront is a big park. It allows the skyline to be framed in a way that it can in other cities. So, the distinctive buildings, even the really tall ones that aren't near the lakefront, can still be seen, and you can actually see them from across the lake here in Indiana. It's yeah. We're very proud of our skyline in Chicago. It is quite nice. And then there have been some big changes to it in the last few years, with like the St. Regis Hotel Tower. But again, the planning seems to be not allowing other skyscrapers to overshadow others. And even an abomination like the Trump Tower doesn't necessarily dominate the
No,
environment that's
indeed.
around it.
I think no. I mean, I agree. I mean, I'm not trying to talk down New York because, of course, New York is so astonishing for its energy
I'm
and
happy to do
again.
that.
But I mean, I think I found, I did enjoy walking the streets of Chicago in a way that New York is slightly overfacing. But I mean, I enjoyed New York for other things, and but as I say, I mean, the Frank Lloyd Wright was really wonderful to see. I went also around some of the University of Chicago and was amazed by the scale of those buildings and that sort of sub-Oxbridge.
Yeah,
You know,
it's bizarre walking around there because you're like, wait, this looks
that's
like wait, no, this doesn't belong here, but I like it.
well, it is quite incredible, and on such an enormous scale. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely unbelievable. And I think it's almost platitudinous to say it, but I mean the scale of everything in the States, both in New York and Chicago, there is something completely extraordinary, and it makes the visitor feel belittled somehow. It's amazing. You just look at it all, and you feel like a tiny ant beneath these
Well,
enormous buildings.
and then you leave a city like Chicago, and then for hundreds of miles, it's flat, empty fields. It's like it's weird that there's this, there's all of these massive buildings, and then there's nothing for hundreds of miles. We're literally a prairie city. It's nice.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Incidentally, Jonathan, when you came to the lecture, how did you come? Did you drive around the edge of the lake, basically? Is that what you did?
Yeah, I actually live closer to Chicago than a lot of people who live in Chicago suburbs do, and so where I am, I'm kind of at the bottom of the arc around the lake, and there's a toll road that goes right from my house right to downtown Chicago. I can be downtown in an hour, and it's a direct route. It takes a bridge that goes over all the infrastructure, and then you're in Chicago. So
You're straight
it's
away in
yeah.
Chicago.
And we can like we're going to the opera on Friday at the Lyric Opera in Chicago, and we'll leave at 4 o'clock. We'll have dinner at 5, opera at 7, and we'll be home in bed
And you'll
by
be home.
11 o'clock. It's great.
Actually, I went to the a friend very kindly got me a ticket to the Frankenstein at the Lyric,
Oh, okay. How
and
was it?
and I mean I really really enjoyed the performance, but I mean also the Opera House interior just
The building itself is worth the price of admission.
it's totally astonishing, and
It,
indeed that sort of opulence. I mean, again, it brought home
scale,
you know
right?
the scale. I mean, I think it's easy to forget in Britain that I think in the tens and the 20s and the 30s, people really were looking at architects and patrons were so aware of what was happening in the States, and that sense of looking to that and trying to find a place for some of those ideas is absolutely apparent in British design. I mean, it's really fascinating, and it's sort of I tend to think of the relationship the other way around, but not at all. I think it's very much informing what's going on in Britain.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually grew up down the street from a Frank Lloyd Wright house here in Indiana, and it just sits there in the landscape perfectly. It's built on a hill to design to kind of go with the hill, and it was just in amongst the trees, and we wouldn't even notice it was there unless you were really looking for it. And then it
Yeah.
was bizarre that there's this World Heritage architecture just down the street from my house.
House.
I live in it. I grew up. I lived in a typical 2-story American, newer built house. Yet 1,000 feet away was a Frank Lloyd Wright masterpiece. It was recently for sale too. It sold for quite a bit.
Do you know the other thing I really enjoyed? I went to the Driehaus Museum. I mean, I saw
Oh, good,
everything I
good. I'm so
could.
glad you did.
And I thought that was fantastic. I mean, I
Yeah.
mean, completely overwhelming. I don't think you could live in such a place, but I thought it was stunning. I mean, the use of different finishes and, so rich and opulent. I really, really astonishing.
Yeah.
Um, and I love the house opposite, which was used, wasn't it, as his office? There's one immediately on the opposite block on the corner,
Yeah.
this sort of 1900s building. I thought, sorry, one other answer to this question is that I was really amazed by the quality of the churches that I visited in New York. And I'm a struggle to find any publication that has looked seriously at those buildings. And I mean, is it the Dominican Church in Chicago with a great crucifix? It's near the Board of Trade building. I can't now remember what it's called. It's either Franciscan or Dominican church with a massive crucifix incorporated into the frontage. It was absolutely astonishing.
Yeah.
And I can't find out anything about these buildings. Though the Chicago churches are less impressive, I think, than the new. I think the fires have meant that they're slightly
Yeah.
more diminutive somehow. But the New
Yeah.
York ones are absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, because we don't really think a lot about our churches, and a lot of them have closed down, or they've lost their congregations, and
Yes, because everyone's moved out. Yeah.
there's even churches in places like Gary, Indiana, which used to be a thriving metropolis, and now it's an abandoned ruin, and now they film movies there because it's artfully abandoned, and it's yeah, we don't really think about our cathedral heritage, especially in Chicago. You're right, the fire did sort of wipe the slate clean, in fairly recent history. And
It's,
so we do have, I think, one or two of note, but I think a lot of people, I think the most famous Catholic church in Chicago is not even in Chicago. It's the church at Notre Dame in South Bend, because that's like where a lot of the Irish Americans in Chicago kind of identify with, and it's a beautiful church. Yeah.
No, well, I mean, I came away certainly from New York thinking I'd like to find out more, and I deliberately went to all the churches I could in Chicago, and I was interested by them, but they were generally a bit less impressive.
Well, and we don't really have any that are a tourist attraction that we visit. I've never been in a church in Chicago. Not even, I mean, to visit, because it's not really,
Something
we're not
people
really
do.
tourists in our own Midwest.
No, well, but it's sort of interesting. I mean, for example, the Anglican or the Episcopalian cathedral, I can't remember what its dedication is. It has an absolutely stupendous open timber roof. I mean, absolutely amazing. But it's not a particularly notable building. The building is basically the roof, and it's extraordinary. And then St Patrick's, the Catholic cathedral, has bits and pieces that look. The side vaults look very like William Burgess things. I mean, again, the way they're finished. Anyway, it's just an
Yeah.
interesting an aside because I thought even in New York people were not very interested in the churches. And actually, they are pretty stupendous things, and we forget how much money was invested in these buildings and the way they were often conceived to be permanent. They are building. You're building for eternity in every sense, and
Well, yeah. And Drury House is an interesting example. Like, it's amazing that it's still there
yeah,
because, you know, the Chicago has no qualms about tearing down
knocking
everything
anything.
to
Yeah.
build something new. We've had skyscrapers torn down to build new skyscrapers. So it's the fact that a Drury House is still there is remarkable, and I hope it continues to stay there. I'm glad you got to see it because I was hoping you would.
It was wonderful. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Um. Okay. All right. A couple more questions here. Um. This is more as a fellow, publisher of a publication. This really interests me.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about the editorial process you kind of go through to do a house feature in Country Life? Like, how do you decide what house to look at, on a week-to-week basis? How do you decide what angle to take? And what do you do differently when you've covered pretty much every house at some point in the magazine's history? How do you make it interesting and different than what's been done before?
So the answer is that houses sort of bubble up in the system in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes people write to me about new initiatives. Sometimes I'm aware of them happening. Sometimes there's a house that I am aware, that somehow just for some reason I suddenly think, gosh, I've never seen that, and wouldn't it be interesting to revisit? Um, the house, writing up the houses always has to begin with a house visit, because until you've seen the house, you don't know really what it is, and you can't come to terms with it. So that's to my own mind, that's the crucial thing. And that sometimes a house visit can tell you that it's not worth writing up again, or there is nothing new, or that something you thought was marginal actually turns out to be really interesting. I mean, I'm always struck by the degree to which people unintentionally sit on stories. They do all kinds of amazing things, and then they'll write you about something completely different and quite trivial. And then you turn up and you think, goodness me, why didn't you tell me that you've done all this other stuff too? And then you say, oh, I never thought of it. We're all guilty of this. It's not just, other people. We fail to see the stories in our own lives because they're so close to us. So when you've had a house visit, it seems to me you know what's remarkable. And the house visit allows you also to plan the photography and what you're going to photograph. It is amazing, but I mean, every year we're still covering several new houses that we've never covered before, and there still are, the well of houses is bottomless, and it's being added to all the time. There are new ones being built, so you can't. There's never any danger of running out, which is, I remember thinking when I first took the job, maybe I would, but I mean, I just don't see any chance of that happening. Once you've seen a house as well, I think you're not only aware of how to photograph it, but what to say about it. And it's great houses of all kinds. I mean, I would draw an analogy with a novel. If you read a great novel at different stages in your life, you will see different things in it because it has many stories to tell, and it's not just one narrative with one analysis. You see different things in different ways because you have different experience and you see it with different eyes. And so you can't endlessly revisit their same houses, but you can go back to major houses and look at particular things and just see them completely differently. And that's a really important thing. And it's not that what was written before is wrong. It just saw that building with a different pair of spectacles. And, you can always go in afresh. And I suppose also photography, there's a big division, I think, now between color and black and white photography. Black and white photography basically looks dated. And so getting color photography immediately means that the photography looks modern. And I think actually in many ways, the most important thing I'm doing is recording things photographically. And even in my own short time as editor, as it were, I mean, I've already covered various buildings that have been destroyed or remodeled or lost, or, all sorts of things have happened, sold on. And so in that moment, you just kind of capture something in that moment in time. And that's really important. And it will, the photographic archive of country life is interesting in large part because that a photograph was taken in about 1984, or because it was taken in about 1922 or 1897. There aren't really other archives that allow you to reconstruct how buildings have changed in that way. So I think you can go back to places, you see them with different eyes, but the crucial to them, and the photography is the most important element of what I do. But, you'll never get to an end of what's there. There's always fresh stuff to see. And, and seeing things in new ways is part of the excitement of working for the magazine.
Great answer. Do you wish you could have more pictures with every article than you do? I mean,
always. But then I think there's also a brutal reality about photographing houses and assembling them in a magazine, is that you realize how quickly images repeat themselves. So it's really difficult finding shots of rooms that show everything but convey the detail. And that's a really skillful image. But once you've got that photograph that shows the framework and the detail, what else do you need to illustrate?
Well, I know when we write articles about houses that I visited, my stance is that the photographs are nice. We should have very nice photographs, but you could have too many, and then they just become one more picture of a nice room. And that you should also let the writing guide you through the house, not just the pictures, because you can only learn so much staring at the picture. Like you said, visiting is such a crucial aspect of getting a sense of place and space that it's indispensable. And I've visited far too many stately homes by this point.
No, well, also I think they repeat themselves. If you have a house which is just neoclassical, and you go into lots of rooms with pairs of columns halfway down, it becomes very repetitive. And you do need that real sense of variety to make things visually interesting. And in fact, a lot of houses you can cover quite comfortably in 6 or 7 photographs. I mean, there are obviously some that need many more, but it's an interesting thing when imagery becomes wallpaper.
Yeah, for every Blenheim Palace, there's Stourhead, which is
exactly.
The house is the least interesting part of the whole attraction there. It's a perfectly fine, lovely house, but I mean, when you have the garden, like, the house is an afterthought.
Indeed.
I don't mean to
denigrate one.
I love Stourhead. That's my favorite National Trust property. But I know what you mean. Yeah. So, what are some challenges you see for great houses and the English countryside in the coming years? What are some big issues that you think that Americans should be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, there are some issues like, rewilding and things that are becoming obviously very contentious politically here, and land ownership and access to land. But I mean, for an outsider, I think those things are arguably less interesting than, the tax regime in Britain has, for the last 30 years, favoured country houses and made it possible to run country houses profitably, and doing all kinds of things from providing holiday accommodation to wedding venues and so forth. And that, of course, that's not guaranteed. If country houses lose political support in Britain, that is something that could change, and it would totally transform the landscape in which these buildings are being managed.
Well, I mean, it has in the past.
And it has in the past,
Yeah.
exactly. And it could again. I suppose it's important to acknowledge that, at the present moment, everybody is feeling the pandemic has made a huge difference. It created a complete hiatus in everybody's activities. There's a lot of reassessment going on of what people do, but it also broke patterns of behavior. And I think the whole question, everybody is struggling a little bit. Visitor numbers are down across the board practically in many areas, and particularly in urban centres, less in the countryside, I think. But everything is everything is reorganizing itself, and I think that the opening of country houses is a very complicated thing. I mean, the treatments, the National Trust of its houses, it spends an enormous amount on preserving its buildings and conserving them. But is it enough? It's renting out more of the properties that were open to the public. It's having to come to terms with the economies of scale that make some properties worthwhile opening, and others are financially, damaging to leave open to the public. So I think there are sort of odd shifts taking place, but it's very hard to see at the present moment really where things are going. I think that my money at present is for really exciting things, is in the private, in the sphere of private owners. There are lots of really interesting initiatives being undertaken by private owners of country houses. And of course, historic houses represents a huge, I can't remember how many properties, but many more than even the National Trusts own. And so I think that's something to watch, because there are lots of interesting experiments going on. And I think that, for the National Trust itself, there are lots of interesting things going on within it, and its attempts to present history in different ways, and contested heritage, which is, of course, very much an issue in the States, is an issue here as well, and how people are going to deal with that, whether it becomes an echo chamber in which rage simply grows with the status quo, or whether people can, overcome the undoubtedly darker side of our heritage is yet to be seen. I think, in fact, I think it's a peculiarity too that that families find it much easier to acknowledge problems with the past than institutions. So, for example, Harwood and Lowther were both doing exhibitions and research about slavery long before the Black Lives Matter movement, and their owners are able to acknowledge that their ancestors were far from being saints, but to get on with it. Whereas the National Trust, I think, struggles with houses that have an association with slavery, just as the British Museum is struggling with these issues, that somehow institutions find it very difficult to take ownership of problematic histories in a way that families, it's quite straightforward. This person was my ancestor, but I'm not that person.
Right.
Whereas an institution often feels that it sort of is the same institution, or it's taken responsibility for that history, which is awkward.
Mm.
So I think those are in the world of country houses, I think that is a big issue. But I just think, as ever, fundamentally, the whole issue is the economy of it all. How can it keep operating? How can it keep running? Has the pandemic knocked things off course in such a way that actually do public attitudes towards country houses change, so that they no longer are seen as a public benefit? I think we're a long way from that ever happening myself. And I think that there is great interest still in country houses and their estates. But it's sometimes a complicated political mix. And I don't know, an American audience will not be interested in this, but the charging of VAT on repairs to historic buildings, this enormous additional tax, it's been an iniquitous situation for decades now. And nobody ever does anything. The government doesn't do anything about it. It feels it doesn't need to. But actually, it really does need to. And if there was one area where I would say, just doubling back in the conversation, possibly not of interest for you, but churches, the future of the English rural parish church, it's felt dicey for a long time, but just at the present moment, it's never felt more precarious.
Right.
And no one's doing anything. Well, I mean, lots of people are doing things about it and trying to see a way forward. But I mean, if we were saving the country house in the 1970s, who's going to save the English parish church, the rural English parish church in the 2020s? Well, it's not apparently going to be the Church of England. And that would be an enormous loss if there isn't something orchestrated. But as ever, I think with human things, there have to be significant losses before anybody takes any notice. Things really have to start going wrong before anybody is prepared to admit that things have gone wrong.
Well, that's that, like you said, that's what happened with the country house in the 70s is, people realized what they were losing and
then they then they value it.
Yeah. Okay. So what are you working on next that's really exciting? Do you have another book project planned, or is there a house history coming up that we should all be looking out for?
Oh my gosh, what is going on? I do have various irons in the fire, but I haven't signed any contracts yet, so I better not advertise any of those things quite yet. I mean, in the immediate future, it's there's just in the next couple of months, it's getting everything done for the magazine in the race towards Christmas, and so there's a lot going on, with the magazine. I think next year there will be, other things going on. We've got the Georgian Group Awards, which are the Georgian Group, which is a means society in Britain. Their major awards coming up later this month, which we were judging over the year. All these restoration projects and different categories of buildings, including country houses. And so that's a big thing that's coming up, aside from the magazine. So, I mean, there is a lot going on, but just at the present, I feel as though having this huge 125th anniversary volume just produced is enough for me. 2023 at least.
All right. Well, let's move on to the lightning round because we're running out of time.
Lightning round. Very good.
So give these answers as quick as you want. I know you answered this at the lecture, but I'm going to ask it again. Your favorite country house or favorite building?
Yeah, and my answer in the lecture, I think, was the last one I've seen, and that's a total cheat. If I was, I do have a favorite, a place I would love if I had endless sums of money and the means to purchase it and to live there. There's a beautiful Regency house created out of the ruins of a place called Brinkburn Priory in Northumberland. And it's in a dell by a river, and it's an absolutely amazingly beautiful place. And it has a monastic church which has been restored in the early 20th century, and right beside this beautiful house. And tragically, it's owned now by English Heritage, or managed by English Heritage, but the house was sort of stripped out partly because of dry rot and partly to find the archaeological features inside it. And so it's this absolutely marvelous house, but it feels like a carcass beside it, and it's just beautifully set. And if I had all the money in the world and the means to acquire it, I think I should invest my time in restoring it, and I would live a sort of sequestered life there. It'd be beautiful.
Kevin MacLeod would love it.
Indeed. Anyway, look it up. It's worth seeing. It's wonderful.
Favorite village?
Goodness, my favorite village. Goodness. What would be a favorite village? I would have to say somewhere near me. Coxwold in Yorkshire is an incredibly beautiful village. It's set within a few miles of the Cistercian Abbey at Byland, but the village itself has a very wide street with some wonderful houses. Shandy Hall, where Tristram Shandy was written, is at the head of the village, and the village runs uphill. There's Newborough Priory country house just outside it, and as the road runs uphill, it comes up towards the church, which has this extraordinary octagonal tower, and it's a very, very beautiful English village, buildings of every date and some very handsome individual buildings within it, but all relatively unpretentious. And at the very end, just as you leave, there's an oak tree with a dead oak tree with a clematis that grows through it, which is magnificent just on the road.
Sounds lovely. Now I want to visit. Do you have a favorite cathedral in England?
Yes, Durham. But that's because I was at university there, and you cannot beat the majesty of those great columns that draw your eye into the aisles and the Neville screen and things. I mean, just stupendous.
Do you have a favorite ruin?
Yes, it would. Well, again, it would be local, but I should give a different. It would be probably Bindon, but I need to think of somewhere else. Hang on. What would? So a really odd place. I've only actually ever been there once. Is Peel Castle. It's on an island just off the Cumbrian coast, and I went there. I had to organise a little boat to take me there across a rip tide. It was incredibly dramatic, and you come to this island, and the ruins are just spectacular. They sit there, and it used to command the route between Liverpool and Ireland, or at least the crossing to Ireland from the northwest of England. It's a really magnificent 14th century building.
And finally, do you have a favorite movie set in a country house or country setting?
Yes. Yeah, now what would that be? I was going to, again, I can't go back to Durham, but I'm always so amused by Harry Potter and spotting all the different buildings, such as Gloucester Cathedral Cloister, Laycock Abbey Cloister, even Durham Cathedral pressed into service as Hogwarts. But I mean, I'm so sad when it comes to spotting buildings. I just so enjoy doing it.
So that's it for my interview with John Goodall. Sorry for the abrupt cut there, but as this was not intended originally to be in the podcast, that was the best spot to sort of stop the recording and transition back to me. So I want to say thank you to John Goodall for interviewing with us. It was a fascinating discussion about British heritage and architecture and history, and the beautiful architecture we have in the Midwest and in the U.S. And so if I highly recommend checking out Country Life magazine every week. You'll see John's work in the magazine, and you'll always read something interesting about a fascinating country house or place. And I love Country Life magazine. It's like a little bit of British paradise every week. Highly recommend subscribing. I subscribe on my iPad in one of the magazine apps, so it's easy to read it and whatnot. So again, thank you to John Goodall. I will link in the show notes. I will put the link to the article that was adapted from this interview, and also link to Country Life and some examples of John's writing, and a link to the book I also mentioned at the beginning. So thank you for listening to the Anglotopia podcast, and we'll see you next time.